Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is Ruth from PDA North America. Very happy to have you all here today, and we're so excited to have our sponsor from PDA North America conference this year on board here to do our AMA today with Dr. Jessica Myszak. So I will let her introduce herself, and then we'll get started with our AMA.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Ruth. I'm Dr. Jessica Myszak. I am a psychologist and the owner of the Help and Healing Center. We are in the Chicago area in Glenview, Illinois. It's a northwest suburb, and we do neurodiversity affirming evaluations for children and adults. So I have a colleague, Dr. Jamie Long, and she and I do lots of adult evaluations for autism, and I evaluate kids all over the country for PDA. Yeah, like Ruth said, but this is the second year that we've been sponsoring the conference just because I think it's so important. And so I will be there. So if you don't get a chance to get your question answered today, feel free to track me down at the conference. So I'd love to connect with some of you there. And I know I see some names that I recognize in the group today. So thank you for coming.
All right. Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into some of these questions that we got. We had so many great ones come through. So thank you to everybody that's supported asking questions. All right. One of them says, if I already have an autism diagnosis, is it worth having a re-eval to know if my son is PDA? We believe that he is, and he is 4 years old.
Awesome. And this is a great question. And this is one that I see pretty frequently. So I think with a 4-year-old, you got to think about what is this going to change and when is this information going to be really important? If a child is at home, if they are in a really supportive setting where their needs are being met right now, in many cases like that, I would say, I don't know that you need to do that right this second. I think the times where having a reevaluation to look at PDA becomes really, really important is if maybe one of the parents needs to hear this to be able to be on board, to be able to support the child in the most supportive way. Or if, the school needs to change their goals or change their approach a little bit. And so in a case like that, I would say, okay, yeah, those are really important reasons to be able to kind of set things off on a really good trajectory. So I would say, especially if the child is younger, if a child is at home and the stuff you're doing is working right now, lots of times I think you could wait a little while until that's no longer the case. And then I think, okay, at that point, it makes sense to get a formal evaluation just because it is hard and it is expensive. And, I think that you got to think kind of big picture here in terms of what is the most important thing that you can be doing to support the family at this point.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay. Question is, our 11-year-old PDA son has a therapist that comes to our home weekly. When asked anything about any challenge, he will refuse or deny, saying we will talk about it later, and just resist discussing. Right now, his therapist is focusing on building rapport through board games and puzzles in the hopes that there's a solid connection and someday will lead to discussions and self-reflection. It's been months and I'm trying to stay patient. I think the demand of talking about himself is the hard part for him. Any suggestions on how to possibly encourage him to open up without talking? Do these PDA kids do better with some kind of nonverbal therapeutic techniques? If so, what might that be?
Yeah, and this is a great question too. So I think you have to be very careful about how you are framing therapy. And I think, as a parent, I totally get you want things moving, you want to be able to, for things to be helpful. But I think you can inadvertently make it a bigger demand by, okay, this is something you can talk about with your therapist. Ooh, this will be something nice that you can bring up. And I think that, I think the therapist is right that relationship building is super important. And I think this question even says, that sometimes the child is losing and that's okay in some of these games, which I think is fantastic and want to highlight that. I think that's amazing. So I would just be very cautious about giving space and trying to kind of stay out of that, as the child and the therapist, as we know about therapy, the connection that a person has with their therapist is the most important part. It's more important than the modality of therapy. And so really, and for PDAers, establishing that trusting relationship, establishing that connection is really, really important. But I did have some thoughts on top of that. So I think, are there ways where, I in an hour a week, what's the chance that something at that point is going to be something he's excited about? So is there another way where, could he have a notebook where he might be able to jot some things down, or maybe voice record if there's other times in the day where that's something that could be really helpful. Um, I also think that sometimes there's ways to get around it that are not necessarily talking about his problems. So, um, what if the therapist had a problem that she was looking and wondering if he could help her problem solve with that, or wonder if they put together a comic book story or something kind of creative or different. And I think sometimes those are ways to kind of talk about something without talking about it. And I think those can sometimes be really helpful. um, you know, talk therapy is tough for a lot of people. And I do think that there's some less talky types of therapies that can be really helpful. The safe and sound protocol is one that a lot of people have had success with. I always encourage people if their child is really into art or music, or horses, I think equine therapy or art therapy or music therapy, or sand tray therapy. There's a lot of things that are a little bit different, and you kind of don't know if it works until you try it. So those might be some good suggestions or some good things, just to see. And it sounds like the child probably has a pretty good relationship with this therapist right now, but I think at 11, he probably has an opinion on what might be helpful for him or what he might want to try. And so, I would talk to him, and if it's his idea, it's going to go a whole lot better.
That's such great advice. Diane, from the founder of PDA North America, also often talks about just like getting a mentor for your child, somebody that is, maybe they're a hired gun for your child, but somebody that can really help out and just be your child's friend and build that relationship, come over to your house a couple hours a week and just play with them, have fun, and just build the relationship. That relationships are just so much more important than that. Relationships can be therapy for these kids. So that's just one thing that she talks about often that I thought I might mention.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, another question was, most of the research around PDA has been conducted on exclusively autistic samples. How does this impact the understanding of PDA outside the autism viewpoint?
Yeah, and this is a really great question, and I think there were several other questions that sort of addressed this question about PDA being on the autism spectrum, or what if someone is ADHD but seems to fit some of this. And um, I think the research that we have right now does look at PDA and autism, and so that's kind of the best understanding that we have. Again, this is an atypical presentation of autism, so this, to a lot of people, doesn't look like autism just because it doesn't look like what they might have expected autism to look like. So that being said, I am not aware of any research looking at ADHD with this presentation. I think this would be a really great area for somebody to look into. And so, yeah, I mean, this is, I sometimes get some imposter syndrome talking about all this because I've learned a lot about PDA. I've worked with lots of people with PDA. I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of kind of what's going on now, but I also think this is an emerging field, and I would not be shocked if we learn more, if there's more research that sort of impacts our general understanding of this, in the years to come. And so, yes, I do think that our primary understanding is PDA within autism, and that's kind of the framework that I work from as I do evaluations. Um, but I'd say our understanding of what could be is absolutely limited, and um, I am totally willing to be proven wrong as we get more information.
Right, thank you. What are good coping skills for parents with PDA who struggle with the demand of toddlers?
Another good question. So yes, I think for so parenting is hard, no matter who you are. It is a challenging time, and I think especially for autistic parents, especially for PDA parents, it can be a really challenging time because a lot of the coping things, a lot of the sort of the strategies that worked before kids, you suddenly don't have as much time to do them. You suddenly don't have as much space for yourself. And so I think, being a PDA and having kids that, may also have some of those traits, because that's sometimes the way that it goes, can absolutely be a challenge. And I think really trying to find supports as much as you can. I have a lot of clients who have relocated to be closer to family, or have had family relocate to be closer to them. I've had families that, will sometimes pay for supports, have nannies or other sort of, kind of regular people that can be in their life and help provide some of that help. And it's hard. I mean, I've heard all sorts of things from different families working with, just trying to figure out, how can we get through this? Because the toddlerhood, it's not going to last forever. So the challenges will change over time. But I think especially with children, like little children, finding ways to play, finding ways to make things a little more fun, both for you and for them, can be really great. And also just, how to stay regulated, making sure it's going to be really hard for you to co-regulate with your kids if you're not regulated. And so the more that, you can make sure you're doing the stuff for yourself, whether that's getting enough sleep or whether that's getting out to get some exercise, the stuff that makes you feel good. One of the things I've had a client share that I think was really, really good was, their therapist told them that if they feel guilty when they're doing it, that's probably the stuff they need to do a little bit more of. And I think there's some truth in that, um, sometimes it feels like, oh man, there's these other things that I should be doing. But you can't be a good parent if you're not taking care of yourself. And so I think doing
Mhm.
the things to do that are really important.
Yeah, and a good reminder that we always tell ourselves in our household is that the low demand lifestyle is not just for the kids. Lower demands on yourself, lower the demands as much as you can on yourself because that will help you that much more.
Absolutely. Well, and then I think even so, there's a just saying that you're lowering that demand versus actually believing it and really letting it go. There's a difference there. And so I think that's super important.
Absolutely. Okay, my 10-year-old was recently diagnosed with ADHD. Can she have PDA or is this just for autistic diagnosis? She fits the traits of PDA. If it's only to do with autism, does that mean I should have her reevaluated for autism?
So, and I think this touches on kind of two of the questions that we've answered before. So, um, you know, there there can be demand avoidance that is not necessarily this PDA profile with autism. And so I think a lot of the low demand strategies that work really well for PDA work with other kids too. And so um, I would say this is kind of a tricky one. So yeah, again, from our knowledge point right now, PDA is a profile of autism. And so I frequently do see kids for evaluation who have had similar situations where they've gotten assessed for one thing. I think especially if the ADHD is treated and suddenly now maybe some of these other things, this is sometimes what happens with kids and with adults too. Sometimes the ADHD can be the predominant thing that's going on. So until it is controlled, until it is treated and addressed, like the ADHD might be all that professionals can see. And so sometimes what I see is kids that get diagnosed with ADHD, they might start a medication or they might, just start accommodating some of these things. And sort of as soon as that's under control, suddenly, wait, now we're noticing all these other things that maybe were kind of under the surface that we couldn't see anymore. And so I would say in this situation, keep an eye on it. And I think, if you can lower some demands around the household and that's working and that's great, it sort of depends again, the needs. Do you need, um, does the school need to hear certain things to be able to offer certain types of supports? And if so, then I'd say that's a good reason to be able to get some documentation of that.
Yeah, great, thank you. Going to ask, there's a handful of questions about assessments. So since that's one of your key things, I'm going to ask those now.
Mhm.
I have an 8-year-old with suspected PDA. I have been given estimates for evaluations ranging from $9K to $450. It's a potentially huge investment for diagnosis, and not many people in the US recognize it, and it's not covered by insurance. What specific tests do you recommend for PDA evaluation, and do we bother?
Yeah. And I get it. It is a lot of money. And the reason that it often does cost a lot of money is that it is complicated to diagnose. I wish we did have a blood test or have a brain scan, something that would be, very easy and definitive, and we don't. Um, So, for older teens and adults, who are very self-reflective, sometimes we can just ask about some of these traits and really kind of get some information. But for kids, it's sort of like being a detective in some ways. It's talking to the family, talking to the teacher, talking to therapists, kind of doing some of these things again, that a child may not be able to verbalize certain things, but sort of finding ways to assess for things in sort of less typical ways. Um, so as for specific tests, um, there is an EDA-Q, which is a measure, and that's one of the things that I commonly use. That's like a rating scale. All of this is so new, and so we don't have a lot of these huge standardized measures that we have for some of the other things. Um, I will say I don't think you usually need 10 hours of testing. I think that, you could do something that's a little bit more targeted, a little more specific, unless you're looking at some of the other things too, unless you're trying to rule out a whole bunch of other stuff. Um, I also have thoughts on the ADOS. So the ADOS is a very commonly used autism measure that is primarily for children, but there's all these levels. And there are some problems with the ADOS. So they do a really good job of marketing themselves as the gold standard. And so a lot of parents come in asking for this measure or thinking that we have to use this measure. But the problem is it doesn't account for masking. And so if you have a high masking child or if you are a high masking adult, it is very, very likely that the scores are not going to be elevated on this measure. And so this is one that I really encourage people to like make sure that if they're going in for an autism evaluation, that it's not, an interview in the ADOS, because if it is, like, probably something is going to get missed. And I do lots of second opinions for people who've had exactly a situation like that. Um, so I mean, for the last part of that question, do we bother? I think that's a personal decision, and I can't tell you, but I think kind of the question behind that is like, so what would change? So if your parenting style or the family's parenting style would change significantly, or if there might be access to other supports, or if the school is going to take things more seriously, um, I think sort of thinking down those lines, if you have a diagnosis versus don't have a diagnosis, what does that mean, and how is that going to look? And I think sometimes that gives you a pretty clear answer in terms of, is this the right thing for you right now?
Yeah, thank you. That was such a great answer to that. How does virtual assessment compare to in-person for preschool age?
Yes. So little kids are tough. They're really tough. So when I started, I did several of these evaluations over telehealth for young kids. And in my experience, these were really, really hard. So at this point now, I usually want to see kids in the office, especially the little kids, because um, when we're assessing for autism, one of the things we want to see is, is it something that is happening in more than one setting? Um, and we also want to separate it a little bit from the parents if we can. And so when you have a child that is running around, that is, having a really hard time engaging on the screen, you can for sure see some demand avoidance, but it's hard to see some of those other things that we're looking for. It's hard to really get a good picture on, some of the social traits and some of the other things. So that's kind of why I don't do that as much anymore. I think that again, for some of the more, really, really typical forms of autism, sometimes that can be, that can work really, really well. But my experience doing PDA evaluations is usually not the real easy cut and dry evaluations. And so they just are more complex. And so that's kind of my take on that.
Yeah, is there an age that you feel like is a good one that would be more acceptable for a PDA evaluation on a virtual?
Um, so my sort of line right now is
Mhm.
6.
Yeah.
And part of that is that at this point, kids have had a chance to be in public school too, or in private school, or to have, again, a different setting to kind of see what that looks like. And sure, some of these kids, are very high masking at school, and, are perfect angels and the teachers say nothing is wrong at all, but then it still gives us a chance to see, okay, so that's the way it is at school. What does it look like, on the way out the door, or what does that look like when they get home? And so that just gives kind of some more information that's really helpful with diagnosing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. PDA courses have taught us about how the nervous system is responsible for fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response, and that using techniques to improve the vagus system can lessen the nervous system response. We've also been told that new neural pathways can be made. Putting the information together, does this mean that what we are doing to stimulate and improve the vagus system will create new neural pathways and make the PDA go away? The information feels contradicting because we're told that PDA is how the brain is wired and will always be part of us. But if we can change the wiring in neural pathways, would this not be curing PDA?
So yeah, and this is a great question.
Mhm.
So I do think it's complicated, and no, we are not curing PDA, and we are not trying to cure PDA. Um, but I think we're learning how to work with it. And I think if you think about one of the ways that I'll sometimes describe this to a littler child is, it's almost like you have this guard dog. Your brain is this guard dog that is sometimes a little bit overprotective, and sometimes can really have a big reaction if it feels like you're being threatened. And so, if we see it like that, okay, then that we're sort of trying to tame the guard dog, let him know that it's okay. And if you've ever seen any of those visuals with the neural pathways, I mean, it's all these tiny little things. And so it's not as simple as like, oh, we're just adding in a new road here. I think what we're doing is kind of adding more space there. So it's almost, I don't know if it's, you call it like greasing the wheel or sort of removing some of the resistance there. I think for sure it can help. And then this is something that works with like ADHD medication. I mean, there's a lot of things that, like, yeah, the more that you learn, the more that you practice some of these things, that it just becomes easier to kind of to work that way. Um, but yeah, wouldn't say that it's the same thing as curing PDA. And we don't want to cure PDA. I think there's some really awesome parts of PDA, and I think as parents, sometimes the challenges are sort of the biggest thing. It's sort of the biggest thing that people, and for sure the biggest thing that people ask questions about. But there's some really awesome PDA traits too, and I've met some really amazing PDA adults who are doing incredible things. And so this for sure is not something we want to cure, but maybe help with some of the challenging parts about it.
Absolutely. Okay. How do you obtain a full diagnosis of PDA when your child is triggered by the actual evaluation process for a PDA diagnosis?
Yes.
Mhm.
Let me see. I had some notes on this because this is a challenge. Um, no, I don't even
And while
see.
she's looking at that, for the couple of folks that just joined, the question was, how do you obtain a full diagnosis of PDA when your child is triggered by the actual evaluation process for a PDA diagnosis?
Um, so I think that this this is tough, and part of my job, like I said, is sort of being a detective, so I'm not saying, oh, the only information I'm getting is from seeing the child right here. It is learning about what happens at home from the parents. It is learning about what happens at school. If they are working with a therapist or an OT, what does that look like? What does it look like there? Um, so the measures that we use are standardized. And so what that means, they have used them with many, many, many children. And so when I see a child who cannot engage with a certain test, or when I see just these significant difficulties, that gives me information. And so I think that that's, maybe I'm not going to get all these standardized numbers, but I'm still getting some really important um, information about how this child is reacting. um, I do think some of the successes I've had, especially with older kids, is sometimes, can they be involved with the process? Can they be, more curious about, okay, is there something you want to know about yourself? Is there something, that would be helpful? And I, sometimes have all sorts of parameters that like kids have set on, so sometimes I say, okay, I will see you for one time. I don't want to hear anything about it beforehand. Or, I'll meet with you 2 times. I mean, so sometimes I'll have kids that will say that, and I will work with it because I know that is challenging. And one of the things I like to do too is be able to meet with the child at the end. And so especially if it's age appropriate, being able to explain from their perspective what I learned and how that might be helpful. And so, if that's something that is useful to them, they might be a little bit more inclined to engage.
Right. Okay. Awesome. We are right at 11:30. So do you have time for one more question?
Yes, we could do one more.
All right, great. Okay. My 7-year-old daughter has recently been diagnosed with PDA. Her occupational therapist tells me she doesn't know much about it. Will attending occupational therapy benefit her? Is there any other specific OT that she should facilitate during her sessions that would support my daughter? Are there other zones of regulation for PDA kiddos?
Awesome. Yeah, no, and OT can be really great for a lot of PDAers. And I think two of the things that it can really help with is one, addressing sensory sensitivities. So sometimes as a parent, it can be really hard. I mean, you kind of judge by what you observe in terms of what might be problematic for a child. But if you can figure out, oh, yeah, we need this accommodation, or oh, here's something we can do to sort of easily improve a child's environment, I think those are huge. The second part is that if we can help in sort of widen that zone of regulation where they can, kind of tolerate and feel comfortable, I think that those are really important pieces and can be really helpful. Um, I've talked to a lot of families that have had really, really awesome OTs. And I think that the key with, successfully working with an occupational therapist, is how willing they are to be flexible, how willing they are to, kind of work with the child and go with the flow. I would say if they are, regardless if they know a lot about PDA or not, they're going to learn. And so if they come in and are like, well, we're doing this and this and this and this, that's probably not going to go very well. But if they can offer some choices, offer some flexibility, find ways to work on certain things, as the child is expressing what they want to do, I think that those can be really, really helpful for a lot of kids.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time today. I'm going to drop some information really quick in the chat for anyone. And Jessica, you are PsyPAC certified, correct?
Yes.
So if you want to quickly explain to folks what that means and just let them know kind of your availability.
Yeah. So I'm always welcome to see people who come to see me in Chicago. But I also have this PsyPAC certification. And so what is cool about that, it's kind of a reciprocity agreement between states, and I think there's it's almost 40 states now, so it's big, and so that's kind of how I'm able to see clients in other states. And so if that's something that you're looking for, you definitely, it's just, I think, psypact.org, and you can look and see if your state is a part of that, and if so, I would be able to see you virtually as well. And then also I told Ruth, I wish we had time to answer every single question today. I do answer a lot of questions on TikTok about PDA and about autism. And so some of the stuff that we didn't get to today, I am going to try to get to on TikTok. And so if you want to find me on there, maybe I will address your question if I didn't get to it today. And I'm just Dr. Jessica Myszak on there if you want to find me.
Yeah, and her website is helpandhealingcenter.com if you want more information there. I've dropped it in the chat as well. So thank you again so much. We can't wait to see you at the conference next week, and we hope to see a lot of your faces there, either online or in person.
All right. Thank you.
Have a good one. Bye.